This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Sign up using the link below and get free access to Nebula, where you can watch my original series, The New F Word. For a lot of Americans, the word socialism means the government coming in and taking your stuff. But having your personal property taken away is a feature of capitalism, not socialism. More and more, our economy is shifting away from personal ownership and towards rent, with the most popular explanations and trends blaming it on millennials' preferences or actively encouraging it. Before we get started, just a quick refresher. Socialists are opposed to private property, not personal property. That terminology is dumb and confusing and an endless source of headache, and all it means is that socialists want collective ownership of the means of economic production, meaning businesses, farms, factories, stores, and so on, and couldn't care less about your toothbrush, your car, your guitar, or anything else you own. We want an end to an economic model where a single individual can have their name on a piece of paper, own a company, and have the final say on how it's operated while their workers who actually make the company productive don't. It's got nothing to do with what's in your house. Private property is bad, personal property is good. That's it. Here's a video I did if you want to learn more about that. In any case, while capitalism is usually upheld as the champion of property rights, that really only applies to private property. Neoliberal governments will fight tooth and nail to make sure capitalists don't have their private ownership threatened in any way, shape, or form. But when it comes to personal property, there are no such guarantees. And you probably already intuitively know this. Personal ownership is slowly being taken off the table for more and more stuff. We just don't have the option for true ownership for an increasing chunk of our personal property. The most obvious example in our everyday lives is probably media, stuff like movies and music. Although vinyl records are having a bit of a comeback, that's nothing compared to the vast majority of people in the US who have given up on owning music and switched to streaming on apps like Spotify and Apple Music. Same goes for movies and TV shows. Hardly anyone buys a DVD or Blu-ray, or even a digital copy of a movie, when streaming on Netflix, Hulu, or Disney Plus is the norm. It's not simply that the medium has changed from the physical world to the digital world, we've switched away from ownership entirely. These services run on subscription models first and foremost, meaning nothing is ever really owned. The monthly fee you pay only guarantees temporary access. And it's not inherently a bad thing, it just is more convenient. But this shift away from ownership isn't limited to subscription services or simply a more convenient arrangement. If you have a Kindle, you might have bought an ebook before and assumed that because the button you clicked on said buy, that you actually owned it in digital format. But you don't. If you've ever read the end user license agreement, which, come on, you'll have seen that it says, quote, Kindle content is licensed, not sold to you. Meaning at any given time, Amazon could revoke your access to the books you've supposedly bought. And it's not just Kindles. More and more, we've seen how the model of ownership we're all accustomed to, where we buy something and once it's in our possession, it's ours to do with whatever we want, has started being chipped away. John Deere tractors now run proprietary software that doesn't allow operators to repair them, and forces them to go to John Deere approved retailers for anything from repairs, to upgrades, to modifications. And if you've ever owned a Keurig K-Cup machine, you'll know that the coffee machine software only lets you brew with Keurig authorized coffee. It's a problem so ridiculous that you need to buy a so-called freedom clip to make your own coffee in your own coffee machine. That's not usually how owning things works. Now, these examples are a bit silly, but the trend of personal ownership being challenged affects much more important things than ebooks and coffee. It's a problem that affects big things, like housing. In the US, the homeownership rate is around 66%. That number doesn't sound so bad, but that's until you put it into context. Over the last 70 years, fewer and fewer people are getting a chance to actually own their homes. Back in the old days, 70% of those born in the 1940s owned a home by the time they were 35. Now, that number is down to 50% for millennials born in the 80s, and it's only getting worse for younger generations. Every year, homeownership gets delayed further and further, and as a result, we spend more years renting, if not our entire lives. More time paying off our landlord's mortgages without ever owning the property ourselves. It's a problem that drains people's finances for years on end, and is one of the biggest roadblocks to having a stable economic and living situation. Needing to constantly worry about homelessness lurking around the corner should shockingly few things go wrong isn't a great way to live. And yet it's what renting implies for millions of people in a country with no universal housing guarantee. Not wanting to buy a home and preferring to rent is fine. That's not the problem here. The problem is that ownership isn't actually available as a choice for that many people, and there's no guaranteed alternative. It's rent with all its problems, or it's nothing. But this problem with ownership follows most people even once they've stopped renting. Homeowners aren't always actually homeowners because most people in the homeowners category are still paying back their mortgages. Or, said differently, today, around 60% of these quote-unquote homeowners are still renting, just from the bank instead of a landlord. And at the end of the day, it's the bank's house until you've paid your loan back. Miss enough payments and the bank will happily make that clear. And there's a unifying trend here. Although a rental-based model of consumption isn't inherently bad for everything, it's not black and white, nor is it happening throughout the entire economy, there is something to be said about the ways in which personal ownership is being challenged today. Despite some people predicting, or even outright wishing for an economy where you're completely dependent on rent-based consumption, there are obviously limits on how far that can actually go, and pros and cons that depend on what kind of consumption and ownership we're talking about. For something like housing, for example, renting has obvious disadvantages. A lack of security at the whims of the bank or the landlord, a regular drain on at least a third of your income, a lack of a stable asset from which to build a secure financial situation for the rest of your life, and of course the depressing reality of just having to deal with your landlord. But for something like music, renting might just be more useful. The thing is that simply focusing on the pros and cons of each kind of consumption misses the bigger picture. What's behind this growth in rent-based consumption is a natural tendency of capitalism. Most of us are getting poorer. We can't help but to rent. Or at least that's a big part of the explanation. While advocates of capitalism like to boast about its ability to lift people out of poverty, the reality is that this is only true for a very short time, if ever. Over time, poverty can only increase under a capitalist economy. That's because the logic of profit-seeking demands that capitalists do two contradictory things: increase their profits and cut their costs. On the face of it, there's no reason these two things can't go together. But the problem is that most productive industries rely on human labor for at least part of the process. Relying on human labor means paying out wages. But when you're in a constant competition for a higher profit margin, the incentive is to find a way to exploit your workers more and more. Whether that means cutting their wages, working them longer hours, increasing productivity with technology or through a different management style, any way to get more out of your workers than your competition, and of course more money than you're paying them, is on the table. The problem here is that this inevitably leads to crises. Over time, with profits increasingly funneled upwards towards the owners of capital, less of the wealth that is produced reaches the workers. And that's a problem because capitalism depends on constantly increasing consumption in order to properly function. What you're left with then is an economy where workers can't afford to pay for the things they make, inequality is on a permanent upward trajectory, and the share of the population that's poor keeps growing. And this isn't just theoretical, it's been happening for decades. The gap between the rich and the poor has been growing since at least the 70s. Recessions, crashes, inflation, and regressive tax policies based on the now debunked trickle-down philosophy have funneled wealth away from the working class and towards the wealthy. And real wages have completely stagnated, with the minimum wage stalling out around $7 an hour when our gains in productivity should have raised it to over $20 by now. The truth is, we can't afford to own that many things anymore. Buying all the movies, TV shows, and songs we listen to is simply out of reach for most people where a subscription isn't. And same goes for rent. The reason people aren't homeowners is because it's just too expensive to be. What we do buy, we often buy with debt. While an endless string of articles has framed this trend as a matter of personal preference, with headlines like, "Why the younger generation doesn't want to own stuff," or "Millennials actually prefer to rent homes than buy them," the reality is that renting is a band-aid for an economy that has killed most people's purchasing power and will continue to do so because it's the only thing it can do. Capitalism works first and foremost for the owners of capital, not workers nor even consumers. What rent allows is the continued profitability of industries that would have gone out of business if they still relied on selling ownership. And it's not simply a matter of technology. Of course, things like the internet allow for services like Netflix to exist, and the developments made in computer chips allow even a simple coffee maker to have a vetting process. But although tech developments may have allowed this model to work, the reason it's flourished is because it's usually cheaper for consumers in the short run, and more profitable for capitalists in the long run. For most things that have fallen into this rent-based selling access model, the majority of the population can't help but accept the trade-off between price and ownership. It might not feel right to pay a monthly fee for a video editing software that'll ultimately cost more than outright ownership, but dropping $500 in one go is just not within most people's reach. We might prefer to actually own our books instead of buying a license, but it's just cheaper this way. We might prefer to own our homes instead of spending decades renting, and then another couple decades paying back a mortgage, but buying a place with straight cash just isn't an option. Renting sucks, but it's often the only financially viable move. And although rental-based models are full of trade-offs, they ultimately do share a common problem. Our lack of ownership over the goods we rent leaves them entirely up to the control of their actual owners. In a pretty trivial but nonetheless telling example, you might remember when HBO removed over 30 shows from their streaming platform earlier this year to avoid paying their creators residuals. The owners of those shows decided they were done with them, and suddenly that catalog vanished and became almost entirely inaccessible. It's not the end of the world, but it's worrying that at any moment, perhaps for something more essential than a few shows, part of a rental-based service might suddenly become unprofitable and disappear from people's hands overnight. Some forms of rent used to be the exception, but in many ways they're becoming the norm, and in increasingly critical parts of our lives. And that means that the amount of things we use every day that now falls under the private property label instead of personal keeps growing. And so, even after the point of sale, the decision power of the capitalist class has been extended a little further. And just to be clear, this isn't some kind of plot. There's no ill will guiding us down this path, or any global conspiracy. The logic of the profit motive, of capitalism, simply guides businesses down the path of least resistance. And in an economy where poverty can't help but grow, and new technology and lack of regulation allow stricter controls over ownership by capitalist enterprises, profiting off of rent is the logical path to take. The New F-Word is a Nebula original series that explores the origins, characteristics, and resurgence of fascism around the world. Instead of taking the History Channel approach of focusing on the battles and leaders of World War II, the New F-Word focuses on the ideology of fascism itself. Where did it come from? What is it responding to? And how can we identify fascism when it appears in the world today? Wherever you stand on the political spectrum, being able to speak knowledgeably about this dangerous ideology is critical. And the New F-Word will give you the tools to do that. The first 4 episodes are available right now on Nebula. What you just saw is a new teaser for my Nebula original series, The New F-Word. I'm really proud of how it's coming along so far, and you can expect 1 episode per month for the remainder of the series. This show wouldn't have been possible without the support of CuriosityStream, who have supported Nebula's efforts since day 1. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As I've shared with you all many times before, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well, especially channels with content like mine. That's why some of my creator friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. We're also super excited to be able to offer this bundle deal, and get you all access to Nebula basically for free. Nebula is home to content from all your favorite YouTubers, all completely ad-free. Between the 2 platforms, there really is something for everyone, and by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content like my original series, The New F-Word, which YouTube would never allow on its platform. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel, and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.